tell you that in this respect, remote viewing is kind of a pioneer frontier field, because in the past it's mostly been used for collecting intelligence or solving problems that have to do with forensics and such, or investing in the sense I've said.
And in that context, there's teams involved. Like even if
usually
people are trained, in your book, you even talk about there's the viewer, there's the analyst, there's the person with the target, right?
Yes. In fact, it's interesting. Remote viewing really is best when there are more people involved and they all know what their roles are. An associative remote viewing project like I just described, you really need usually two people. Now, there's one case where a guy did it all himself, but he was a computer genius, and he programmed his computer to present targets and do the judging and all that stuff. It's just way complicated, and it's out of the reach of most people. So normally you need to have more than one person involved in it. One of the crucial things that I should have mentioned long ago, and I didn't, in a remote viewing session, the viewer should not know what the target is.
Right, you put that in your book, actually, again and again and again.
It is absolutely crucial. If the viewer knows what the target is, you cannot rely on the data that's produced.
But what if the viewer, like, let's say I come in and I get trained in Austin, and I'm asking the question, I'm trained in viewing, right? But I'm asking the question about a particular stock. You mean that can't happen? I'm confused.
Well, in an associative remote viewing thing, you can, because you can know what the stock is. You just can't know what the targets are that are linked with the outcomes.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
I got you.
So, but there is now some work afoot to look into medical remote viewing. There's a bunch of folks playing around with it, to some degree having some success. It's not, there's only, oftentimes it's kind of an ad hoc hobby kind of approach where it isn't carefully controlled and it isn't carefully pursued. So that we aren't making quite the progress that I really would like to see. But there are some value in that. I mean, you use remote viewing in a situation where you don't really have a medical test that can accomplish what you need to accomplish or whatever. But it's a very interesting thing that people are intrigued by, applying it in a medical field.
Can you talk about the signal line? I would really like to go back to how the signal line. Explain what you mean, and I want to quote something from page 166 in your book. Okay. It says, the goal of remote viewing is to set the subconscious to loosen its grip on some of this hoard of data so we can do something useful with it. It first must get across the Lyman or the Lyman?
Lemon.
The Lyman.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and how does this relate to what you were referring to as the signal line in the subconscious?
Well, the signal line is kind of a term of art that Ingo Swann coined to capture the notion of the information that comes in to the viewer. Because we don't know how it gets there. We don't know what carries the information. We don't know any of that stuff. So we had to have a term to refer to the information gaining process. And signal line was a good choice. The reason it isn't just signal is because the word signal implies some kind of for many folks, you might think of electromagnetic sorts of phenomena, and it is definitely not electromagnetic. This is something else that we just don't understand. So the information comes in, and signal line is the word we use for that. But the problem is, I think most people involved in the field think that we have all kinds of ESP information entering our subconscious all the time, but it normally gets filtered out before it ever gets to conscious awareness. And so the methodology is aimed, the CRV methodology is aimed at trying to help the viewer bring that ESP content up into conscious awareness, where we can work with it, where we can report it, where we can objectify it so that other people know the information. It doesn't do us any good in the subconscious, or relatively little good. It helps in intuition oftentimes, of course. But generally, it doesn't have a broader use unless we can actually cognize it and actually bring it out and make it something that other people can be aware of. You see, it doesn't do any good to have a underlying hunch that there's a terrorist attack going to happen. What does help is if you actually can describe the circumstances and give a good description of the location. But you can't do that if it's still hanging out just in your subconscious. Now, the lemon is the threshold between the conscious awareness and the subconscious. And in a way, it's also another hand-waving term, since we don't know exactly what the subconscious is or what makes that different, right? It's just not the consciousness. But nonetheless, the idea is to get the information up across the limit and into the conscious awareness.
So there's something that you mention a lot in your book called analytical overlay, which you said was one of the most important aspects of training you got out of SRI. Can you explain that to the listener and how it relates to the signal line and remote viewing?
Absolutely. Analytical overlay was originally identified by Ingo Swann. They observed it in the early remote viewing experiments at SRI, but it was really explicitly described and explained by Ingo Swann. And in fact, it's right in the middle of this huge CIA report that was declassified. It's quite interesting to see how that fit in. The idea of analytical overlay is that your left brain, and I've sort of tangentially referred to this, the left brain, all of our left brains, is the residence of what a prominent psychologist named Michael Gazzaniga called the left brain interpreter. That means is our left brain, its job is to assign meanings, to interpret, to explain, to understand information that comes in from our senses. And in normal situations, it's pretty good at that. You know, you're walking down the street, certain things happen, you observe them happen. The conclusion you come to based on your left brain processing of the sensory information is usually pretty accurate. But when you get into a low bandwidth situation where the information flow is really kind of limited, such as in an ESP sort of an experience, the left brain doesn't have enough information to work on, and so it starts jumping to conclusions. It will interpret things, perceptions that you have, wrongly, and then that's what you think is what you're experiencing, is this conclusion that your left brain has jumped to. So a very quick example, if you're walking out in the woods during the daylight hours and you see a stump that has a kind of a bear outline of a bear, you look at it and say, oh, that looks like a bear, isn't that funny? And you go on, you don't have any issues. But let's say you were out walking at dusk and everything's indistinct and you see that stump, but it looks like a bear now even more so because it's in the dark. You may not realize it's a stump. You may actually think it's a bear. Your left brain says, oh no, it's a bear, let's get out of here, right? When in reality, it's still just the same stump, but you have less information about it, and therefore your left brain doesn't have enough to work on. It's kind of like, I'm certainly sure you had a friend come up to a conversation. The conversation's been going for 20 minutes, and they hear one sentence. And based on that one sentence, they think they know what you're talking about, and then they say something absolutely stupid, right?
I see this all the time.
Yeah. So that's what your left brain often does in a remote viewing environment, because it doesn't have enough information, but it still feels like its job is to tell you what that means.
So how do you put the left brain in its place?
Well, that's what the process is. Let me say something else, then I'll get to that. One of the reasons why psychic experiences have been so hard to capture in a lab is because for so long, people didn't understand, either psychics or researchers, didn't understand this idea of analytical overlay. They couldn't figure out why sometimes the information was really accurate and why other times it was just completely baloney. They couldn't figure that out. We now have a much better understanding of that because we now understand analytical overlay. It's still a challenge because it's still hard sometimes to tell whether something is analytical overlay or whether it's real signal line.
Is that why you have people both sketching and describing what they're seeing at the same time?
That's one of the solutions. Okay, the first thing is, the rule is, you describe, you don't name. So what that means is, a name is a noun. If you're going along and you get the impression of some crisscrossing steel girders, and you want to say, oh, it's a bridge, that's your left brain getting it. It might actually be the Eiffel Tower, because the bridge and the Eiffel Tower may look similar. You don't say it's a bridge. You say it reminds me of a bridge. You kind of identify it as analysis, and you exclude it. You don't exclude it, but you put it over on the side as kind of in a holding pen. Okay, I had this conclusion. It's a bridge. I think that's analysis. I'm going to put it over here. Okay, and I'm going to exclude it from the data for now, and when we find out ultimately what the target is, we'll know whether that's right or not. So you learn to identify AOL. You learn to identify it. You learn to sort it out. But there's